In April 2026, the United States Navy was doing something that made the Iranian oil ministry very nervous. More than a dozen American warships were sliding into position along Iran's entire Persian Gulf coast. But the Navy wasn't there just to stop tankers. It was there to start a clock. And the Iranians had 9 days to figure out what the clock was actually counting down to. Iran has 1,500 nautical miles of Persian Gulf coastline to work with. And the entire export economy of the Iranian regime, the IRGC payroll, the nuclear program, the social control budget, the proxy networks across the Middle East, funnels through a single 8-kilometer outcrop sitting 25 kilometers offshore. The infrastructure on the island matches the size of the stakes the regime placed on it. 7 loading jetties, labeled T1 through T7, stick out from both shores so multiple tankers can load at once. A storage tank farm holds 30 million barrels of crude across roughly 60 individual tanks laid out in a defensive grid. A network of subsea pipelines runs under the seabed, connecting Kharg directly to Iran's 4 largest onshore oil fields. Those fields are Avaz, Marun, Gaksaran, and Agajari, all of them sitting in the Khuzestan province on the Iranian mainland. Iran has known Kharg was their single point of failure for 40 years, but they built it that way deliberately. Concentration is efficient. It's also a target. And concentration was exactly what the United States used against them. Even during Operation Epic Fury, when American strikes destroyed air defense radars across Iran's southern coast, the oil terminal stayed off the target list. The White House made the call publicly. Kharg was the one piece of Iranian infrastructure the Pentagon would not touch with a missile. 4 years of Iraqi bombing said it couldn't be broken anyway. The Pentagon's reasoning was about something different. They had a better idea. Iran's takeaway from 40 years of attacks was simple. Kharg is unbreakable by force. The mistake in that takeaway was assuming the only way to break Kharg was with weapons, and Trump found a different way. The United States Navy did something nobody had attempted in the Persian Gulf for decades. They locked down Iran's entire coastline, not just the Strait of Hormuz, but the whole thing. Over 10,000 American personnel showed up in theater within a week. More than a dozen warships parked off the Iranian coast. Boeing P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft circled at altitude around the clock, swapping out in shifts. Inside an hour of the blockade closing, a tanker captain off Bandar Abbas couldn't twitch his rudder without a destroyer screaming a speed and heading correction at him before he finished the turn. 2 specific pieces of equipment on the P-8 made that level of coverage possible. Sitting in the nose of the P-8 Poseidon is an ANAPY-10. It's the kind of surface search radar that doesn't just spot ships at range. It tells you whether a ship is loaded or empty by how deep she sits in the water and whether her engines are running by reading the wake she leaves behind. The Boeing P-8 Poseidon, a militarized 737 frame, 41 meters long, top speed 490 knots, range of 12,000 nautical miles on station. 2 Rolls-Royce engines, 11 crew, room in the bomb bay for torpedoes, sonobuoys, and Harpoon anti-ship missiles. The American taxpayers' investment in a single P-8 runs about $290 million. And on April 13th, every dollar of that earned its keep over the Persian Gulf. If you look here at the belly of the aircraft, you'll see this gyro-stabilized turret called the MX-20HD. It's a multi-spectral camera package, daylight, thermal, image intensifier, and laser rangefinder, all crammed into one ball. The whole thing is stabilized to compensate for every bump and bank of the airframe. From 25,000 feet, the MX-20HD can read the IMO number, the 7-digit hull serial number that follows a ship from launch to scrapyard, like a social security number but for ships, painted on a tanker's hull from over 30 nautical miles away. Imagine a camera with telescope-grade zoom mounted on a gyroscope, precise enough to keep crosshairs on a quarter from a moving train. That's the system reading every license plate in the Persian Gulf. Detection is the easy part of the job. Stopping a 333-meter, 300,000-ton tanker is the part that takes geometry rather than firepower. The destroyer slid into position 5 nautical miles ahead of the tanker, perpendicular to her course, and simply parked. What it was, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, 509 feet long, 9,200 tons, top speed 30-plus knots, Aegis combat system, 96 vertical launch cells loaded with everything from Tomahawks to SM-6 interceptors, plus a 5-inch deck gun with 2 CIWS systems for close work. The American taxpayer paid roughly $2.2 billion for each one. None of that ordnance ever left the rail off Iran. The geometry was the weapon. That was the entire opening move. The radio call on VHF Channel 16, the maritime equivalent of 911, came 30 seconds later. The choice was simple: reverse course back to Iranian waters or accept a Marine boarding party on your deck. By sundown on April 13, 42 tankers had turned around without anyone firing a shot. The reason none of them tried to ram a U.S. warship comes down to the physics of the ship they were driving. None of them tried to ram a U.S. warship for the same reason no one tries to parallel park a strip mall. A fully loaded VLCC needs 3 miles to stop and 2 to turn. With a destroyer 5 miles ahead, the only realistic option is to comply with the radio call. Some captains refused anyway, not by ramming, nobody tried that, but by ignoring the radio call and continuing west toward the open Gulf. Those ships got Marine boarding parties dropped on them within the hour. A Marine fast rope team putting boots on a Suezmax deck is not a negotiation. By sundown, every captain in the Gulf heard the radio traffic and knew exactly what the second option looked like. By the end of the week, 41 more tankers had frozen at anchor or alongside the loading jetties. Their captains refused to leave Iranian waters because they knew what waited for them outside the territorial line: 69 million barrels of crude oil going nowhere. 40 years of Iranian planning around the Strait of Hormuz, mining strategies, swarm tactics, anti-ship missile batteries, and proxy harassment was all built around keeping oil flowing under threat. None of it was designed for the simple problem of U.S. destroyers parked in open ocean refusing to let ships move at all. The door is locked, but the pipelines from the mainland never stop pumping. Here's where the destruction begins, and here's also where most reporting on the Kharg blockade got the story wrong from the start. The American media kept calling this a blockade, and that word makes the whole operation sound temporary and reversible, something that ends when the ships go home. The blockade was just the trigger event. The damage came from what the blockade triggered downstream from the coast itself. When the blockade closed at dawn on April 13, the pumps in Khuzestan province didn't stop running. The valves at the wellheads didn't close, and the pressure differential between the rock and the surface gear didn't budge. The same 1.85 million barrels of crude that left Kharg's tank farm yesterday had nowhere to go today. Onshore storage in Khuzestan absorbed the bulk of it. The overflow, roughly 600,000 barrels a day, went straight into Kharg's own tanks, on top of every barrel already sitting there. The reason is the same physics that makes oil fields work in the first place. If you look here at this cross-section of an Iranian oil reservoir, you'll see why the regime can't simply turn the production off when they want to. Crude oil sits inside porous rock formations under enormous natural pressure, with thousands of psi pushing up through every wellhead in the country. That pressure is what makes the oil flow to the surface in the first place, and it's also what makes the system impossible to throttle quickly when something goes wrong upstream. Iranian onshore reservoirs operate at 1,500 to 3,000 psi formation pressure on average, and a controlled, gradual shutdown of a mature field takes weeks of careful work. Pressure has to come down in stages, with chemical injections to keep the rock from sealing itself off. You have to give the rock time to spread the load before anyone touches the next wellhead in the sequence. An oil field is a pressurized system the size of a mountain range. Shutting it down fast is like trying to brake a freight train by throwing a deck chair in the tracks in front of it. Physically possible, but if you're standing downstream, the consequences land on you. Iran pulls about 3 million barrels per day out of the 4 offshore fields feeding Kharg through the subsea network. Domestic refining and consumption eats about 1.15 million of that production each day. The remaining 1.85 million barrels every single day was supposed to ship through Kharg. This is the part of the story Iran's planners didn't think through. They built Kharg to handle attacks from the air and the sea, but they never built it to handle full inflow with zero outflow at the same time. Nobody had ever blockaded their entire coast and made them sit with their own oil before. Every commercial intelligence firm in the world watched Kharg's tank farm fill in real time across April. And they did it with the off-the-shelf satellite optics because of one piece of equipment sitting on top of every tank in the farm. Crude gets stored in floating roof tanks at every major terminal on the planet. Unlike a fuel tank at a gas station, a floating roof tank has no fixed top at all. The roof itself sits directly on the surface of the oil and rises and falls with the fill level. From orbit, the position of that floating roof tells you exactly how full the tank is at any given moment. From 450 kilometers up, you can measure the shadow the outer tank wall throws onto the floating roof. With off-the-shelf satellite optics, the roof rises about 1 meter for every 50,000 barrels added to the tank. Reading a Kharg tank's fill level from orbit is like reading a measuring cup through a frosted window. You can't see the liquid itself, but you can see exactly where the surface line is sitting at any moment. Every analyst with a Planet Labs subscription was watching the same thing happen in real time across April. Kharg's tank farm holds 30 million barrels of crude oil across roughly 60 individual storage tanks. On April 13, the day the blockade closed, the tanks held about 18 million barrels, roughly 60% of capacity, which is normal headroom for a working terminal. By April 16, they held 19.8 million barrels, 66%. By April 20, satellite analysis showed the tank farm at 74%, about 22.2 million barrels. By April 23, it crossed 80%. The Iranians did the same math anyone else could do at that point, with roughly 600,000 barrels per day backing up into Kharg's tanks and onshore storage already saturating across Kazakhstan. The tank farm hits physical maximum on April 28. That left them 5 days from a 30 million barrel terminal venting crude into the Persian Gulf and nowhere left upstream to absorb the surplus. By the morning of April 23rd, every tank at Kharg was past 80% capacity. Here's why that number ends the story for the Iranian oil ministry and why 3 days was all they had left to decide. A floating roof in cross-section explains why operators never fill these tanks to physical capacity. A floating roof is basically a giant steel pontoon that floats on top of the oil and rides up and down as the tank fills and drains. It hits hard mechanical limits at both ends. It can't rise above the overflow weir without smacking into it, and it can't drop below a certain point without sitting down on its support legs. API 650 is the rule book the oil industry follows for welded storage tanks worldwide. It tells operators to stop filling well before the tank is physically full, both to keep enough room for normal shipping cycles and to keep the roof from slamming into the overflow weir. In practice, that means operators stop letting more oil in somewhere between 80 and 90%. The 80% mark on a floating roof tank is not a fire alarm. It's the point where the system stops being able to absorb a mistake from the operators. Below 80%, you have hours to react if something goes wrong on the loading rack. Above 80%, you have minutes. Above 90, you have seconds. The IRGC engineers running Kharg knew exactly where they were on that curve. They had managed this terminal through rocky air raids and 40 years of sanctions. They had never managed it with the export valve welded shut. At that fill rate with zero outflow, Kharg's tank farm crossed 80% on April 23rd. It hit 90% on April 26th and was projected to reach the physical maximum on April 28th. After that point, the floating roofs would smash into their overflow weirs and the tanks would start dumping crude all over the terminal. Iran had 3 days to make the worst decision in their oil ministry's history. They had to choose between 2 ways of losing. On April 23rd, Iran's IRGC oil ministry faced 2 paths forward, and both paths lost. The question was, which way to lose less? Here are the 2 options that hit the IRGC oil minister's desk that morning, and here's why it wasn't really a choice. Option A meant keeping production going at full rate, which meant the tank farm would cross 90% in 3 days and physical maximum at 5. After that, floating roofs would slam into the overflow weirs and tanks would start dumping crude all over the terminal. A vapor cloud at a 30 million barrel facility becomes a fire risk that can take Kharg's surface infrastructure off the map for years. Option B meant emergency shutdown of the 4 onshore fields, dropping production from 3 million barrels per day to 0 in hours instead of weeks. Option A's bill, vapor ignition, tank farm fire, 90% of Iranian export infrastructure gone, and a multi-year rebuild. Option B's bill: uncontrolled depressurization across mature reservoirs, water encroachment, capillary blocking, and recoverable reserves gone for good. It's the difference between burning your house down and salting your land. The fire is faster and louder, but the salt lasts forever. Option A loses Kharg. Option B loses the fields. Both options end at the same place. Iran cannot export oil at pre-war volumes ever again, and the only real difference is which piece of infrastructure goes first and how visibly it goes. They chose option B. At 04:05 local on April 23rd, control rooms across Khuzestan province started closing wellhead valves one by one. The four fields, Havaz, Marun, Gaksaran, Al-Gajari, dropped from a combined 3 million barrels per day to functionally zero in less than 4 hours. This is the part that doesn't recover. Everything before this point was reversible in theory. Bring the ships back, restart shipping, drain the tanks, and the tank farm might survive. The infrastructure on Kharg might survive. The moment those wellhead valves closed in Khuzestan, Iran's oil economy lost something it cannot get back. And here's why. The damage started inside the rock formations themselves, deep underground beneath the four fields. Deep inside the reservoir rock, the boundary between oil and water is the part that broke first. Mature Iranian fields are stacked like layers in a pressurized cake, oil-bearing rock on top, natural aquifer water below. And steady production keeps the boundary between those layers stable. Sudden shutdown collapses the pressure differential almost immediately, and the aquifer water rushes up to the oil-bearing rock. Petroleum engineers call this water coning. Once water enters the oil-bearing zones, capillary force permanently locks whatever oil is left inside the rock pores, the way water in a sponge traps the air pockets it can't push out. To get the oil flowing again, you need to push past the capillary blocking pressure, usually north of 1,000 psi in low permeability reservoirs like the ones feeding Kharg. The reservoir can't make that pressure on its own once the natural drive is gone. A U.S. regulatory document on oil and gas infrastructure described this kind of damage in 2 words: irreversible and permanent. Restarting a water-coned reservoir is like trying to suck a milkshake through a straw clogged with concrete. The milkshake is still in the cup. The straw is the problem. You can't fix it from outside, and there's no way to clean it from the inside either. The 4 fields feeding Kharg are some of the oldest in Iran's lineup, and decades of production have already drained most of the natural pressure drive in each one. Sudden shutdown this late in a field's life is the worst possible time to attempt it, and the engineers running those wells knew that. Down on the seabed between the 4 fields and Kharg, a second problem was forming nobody had planned for. When flow stops in a cold subsea pipeline, the methane and water sitting in the line freeze together into crystals. Engineers call them methane hydrates, and these crystals start clogging the pipeline as they grow. Once they form, you can't flush them out, period. The pipeline has to be cut open and physically replaced section by section. These hydrates start forming within hours of the flow stopping at typical Persian Gulf seabed temperatures, and a single plug can knock a 27-mile subsea segment out of service. A methane hydrate plug is a kidney stone in a 6-foot-wide pipeline at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. There's no specialist in the world who can dissolve it. Even if Iran could reverse the reservoir damage, and they can't, the subsea pipelines connecting the fields to Kharg were filling with hydrates by the hour. Getting the oil flowing again means rebuilding the subsea pipeline network from scratch, a multi-year project even on a good day. Trump's public estimate from the White House lawn 3 days later was vintage Trump. And you didn't need a translator to understand it. Iran loses up to 50% of its oil production capacity, permanently. Pre-war output ran 3 million barrels a day. Post-shutdown best case, half of that. The oil is still in the ground. And even if Iran tried to mine the strait to keep ships out, you should watch this video to see how the U.S. Navy would demine it. Bye for now.